Good morning, everybody. It's a real privilege for me to be here and to witness the core of a stake that is interested in preparedness, because you are a unique group of people. Not everybody is committed to preparedness, or more like it feels like a distraction, but you are the group that are thinking one step ahead to try to determine how we can avoid disasters. We'll have things happen. There will be crises, but whether they become a disaster or not is our choice. And that choice is whether to be prepared or to do nothing. I'll try not to stand in the way there. I love this picture. This is from a recent hurricane, and you can see that there's been a lot of destruction, except for a couple places. And the difference between those places and the others were that they used the knowledge about how to survive a hurricane to construct their homes. And the others probably were constructed a long time ago and didn't benefit from that knowledge. So to put the house up on stilts so that the storm surge could go essentially through the structure and not take it out. You can see that it looks like that one 3-story house received no damage at all, and everything else is completely destroyed. And that's a very key point. You can't just move everybody out of the way of a hazard. There's some that you don't want to build next to, like a really unstable slope. Not much you can do about that if it breaks and buries your house. So you need to move away from something like that. But on a coastal plain, you can live with the hazard. And it probably didn't cost that much more to build that house than the ones around it. And so the whole purpose of preparedness is to reduce fear, to have no fear. And that's what that house represents, is a situation in the midst of chaos where people were able to survive the hazard. There's a difference between a disaster and a hazard. A hazard we can't control. We're going to have earthquakes, we're going to have hurricanes, we're going to have floods. But we can control how we respond to them. And so I'd like to focus on that first, the spiritual aspect of preparedness. So I want to ask you the question of what is the redeeming power of preparedness? Ideas? Oh, good, thank you.
We do all we can, and the Lord does the rest.
I like that. We do all we can, and the Lord does the rest. Okay, yes?
We don't live in fear.
We don't live in fear. That's right. We do all we can to control that. Excellent. Others? Yeah.
Don't panic, buy toilet paper.
Thank you. Did everybody hear that? You want to say it louder?
We don't panic, buy toilet paper.
Okay. Yeah, I like the fact of not panicking, because we don't think very well when we're panicking. We do things that are irrational, that sometimes put us more at risk. Any others? Comments? Okay. I like the definition of spirituality by David O. McKay, that it's the consciousness of victory over self and communion with the infinite, especially the consciousness of victory over self part, because really that's what preparedness is. Our natural man wants to put things off. Our natural man wants to do what's easy. Our natural man doesn't want to think ahead and make decisions and do things that might not pay off in the long run or in the short term, but may pay off in the long run. The natural man doesn't even care about the long run. And so it's one of the most important things we have to overcome is our tendency to act like the natural man. The natural man does not prepare. Okay, so I've got a few things here that I think are spiritually connected to preparedness. The first one is personal revelation. For example, think of Joseph of Egypt who received a revelation in a dream about a drought that was coming. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so Joseph of Egypt was able to talk to him. Pharaoh believed him, okay? And they were able to pay up front. They gathered enough material, the abundance, they made sure that they saved it up and so that they could bless the land. And his preparedness paid off not only for especially the poor people that were there, but also for his own family. There's also a difference between the natural man who is reactive in almost all situations and the spiritual man or woman who is proactive. And that's what preparedness is. It's being proactive. It's saying, okay, what can we do to minimize the risk? And doing it. Ether chapter 2, I'd like to read that. This is the Lord talking to the brother of Jared. For the winds have gone forth out of my mouth, and also the rains and the floods have I sent forth. What shall ye do? What shall ye that I should do? So he's asking the brother of Jared. Okay, these are natural things that are part of the laws of the universe that you're having to deal with here. And you're going to be tested. What would ye that I should do? And I can testify to you that the Lord will give us personal revelation in answer to that question. Alma, I also like the Book of Mormon and how much it talks about preparedness. For example, Alma's people were getting lazy and natural mannish, right? And so what did he do? He came up with a preparedness project for them. They went around and they started to fortify all the cities. This was during peacetime. It's hard to get people motivated during peacetime because we're all so used to immediacy, right? Emergency. We focus too much on emergency preparedness and not enough on disaster preparedness in advance. And so they went around and they fortified all the cities. And when the Lamanites came, which they didn't know when they were going to come, they knew it was likely because they had come in the past and they were likely going to come again, right? So let's get ready for it this time. And they were able to overcome the attack by the Lamanites. But more importantly, what happened before the Lamanites came is they built a unity among their people because they were working together on this project. That's what preparedness does. It's apolitical, and it brings people from all walks of life together. And whether the Lamanites came or not didn't matter anymore because he'd achieved what the Lord wanted him to do, and that was to unify, to gather, to bring people together, to work together. President Benson says things like very few prophets ever said. This is what he said. Too often we bask in our comfortable complacency, natural man, rationalize that the ravages of war and economic disaster or famine or earthquakes, we could maybe say pandemics, that they cannot happen here. Those who smugly think that these calamities will not happen, that they somehow will be set aside because of the righteousness of the saints, are deceived and will rue the day that they harbored such a delusion. Wow, that's a call to action, right? President Hinckley, in his talk on If Ye Are Prepared, You Shall Not Fear, said this, and this is a very important thing that I think we need to understand. Now, I do not say, and I repeat emphatically that I do not say or infer that what has happened, he's talking about the Hurricane Katrina, and also the earthquake in Indonesia. What has happened is not the punishment of the Lord, Many good people, including some of our faithful Latter-day Saints, are among those who have suffered. Just as there have been calamities in the past, we expect more in the future. And we shouldn't think of these as, okay, that happened over there because those people were wicked. That's been a common theme for the way that people think. Okay, Hurricane Katrina, let's talk about that for a second. It's the most costly U.S. natural disaster to date, up to $170 billion in losses. But a decade before that happened, there was an effort to try to get the Army Corps of Engineers to strengthen the levees. They did a study to figure out how much it was going to be. It was going to cost about $7 billion to do that. And so most people thought that was going to be way too much. So they canceled the project. Actually, what it really cost them was 25 times that because they didn't do anything about it. It reminds me of the scripture in D&C 101 where it says, "What need hath my Lord of this tower?" These are building watchtowers around the community, or a levee, or other things. What need have we of these, seeing that this is a time of peace? Might not this money be given to the exchangers? For there is no need of these things. That's Satan speaking through the natural man right there. And all of us have to deal with that cost-benefit analysis, right? Okay, so I gave a talk like this in May to another stake around here in Ahead-Lehi, and they were really concerned about the fact that we'd had a record snowfall, which means record water runoff. And they wanted me to tell them if there was going to be a flood or not. I said, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you what Utah has done to prepare. After 1983, when we had huge floods all over the Wasatch Front, we even had more snow this time. But like I said to them, there have been many things that have been done since that flood to prevent it from happening again, like catchments being installed at all the mouths of the canyons. So we did all of these things. We expanded the drainage systems. We built some new backup reservoirs. For example, we had Deer Creek, but we didn't have anything above that. So Jordanelle was built as a way to minimize the impact on Deer Creek Dam. And the same happened with Little Dell. Reservoir was built as a way of preventing Dell Reservoir from overflowing like it did in 83. And fortunately for us, there were years of drought before this year and last year, which made a huge capacity in our reservoirs and in the groundwater for all of this water to go. And I just told them, I don't think there's going to be a flood based on these things that we've done. The reservoirs, for example, at that time were half full. And that's why I show this little picture. That, you guys know, that's what the reservoirs were like before last year. And it's because of paying up front and doing the things that we knew that we could do to prevent a flood that prevented the flood. Just as much water or more water came down from those mountains. It was also helpful that we didn't have really, really hot weather early on. So these are the things you have to rely, these things you can't control. But even if those things would have happened, I don't think there would have been a flood, even if it would have got really hot in July. So let's talk a little bit about the geological hazards that threaten Lehi. Okay? Here's a list, a checklist, because in the Stake and Ward Emergency Preparedness Guidelines, these guidelines right here, which come from the handbook, the first thing you're supposed to do is to identify the likely disasters. I wouldn't use that word disasters, I would use the word hazards. Because a disaster is when you meet the hazard unprepared. So that first one, when it says identify the likely disasters, would have to include not just the natural forces on the earth, it would also have to include the people, whether they're prepared or not. And so hurricanes, no. Volcanoes, tornadoes, avalanches, rock falls, avalanches, maybe if you live up there. Rock falls, maybe if you live next to the mountains. Wildfires, no. Landslides, I put that in gray because I don't know how far your state goes up towards the mountains. But down here, you're not going to have to worry about that. Floods, well, you're kind of in a floodplain right here, right? But you've got all of Utah Lake, and you've got all these reservoirs above you. It's not likely that there's going to be a big flood here that's going to affect you. So, but it could happen. That's why I put it in gray. The only thing you really need to worry about here in terms of natural forces and hazards is earthquakes. And it's a big one. It's the most difficult thing to do anything about. But we're going to talk about that. There's also human, we call them natural disasters, but most disasters are human disasters that are exacerbated by some natural event. For example, what happened from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans was a human disaster that was exacerbated by a natural event because they didn't fix the levees. Because this doesn't really affect you guys that much because you're not there unless you move up to Traverse Mountain. But Traverse Mountain is a huge mega landslide. And now we've got houses all over it. Geologists warned people before those houses were constructed not to do it, right? And the contractors win almost every time. The developers. Moroni is missing an arm and a trumpet, right? Fortunately, that earthquake was only a 5.7, or that whole temple would have been destroyed. And before that earthquake, President Nelson had already decided to pick up the can that had been kicked down the hall, prophet after prophet after prophet, right? I visited with President Hinckley about this directly, and I said, you've got to do something about the symbol of the restoration in Utah. It's going to go down hard and fast from an earthquake. And finally, President Hinckley told me, he said, well, I hope it doesn't happen on my watch. He was prophetic about that. But that's President Nelson standing in front of what's happening right now. So why do we have earthquakes along the Wasatch Front or in Utah? And so I can't help but talk about geology, right? That's just what my passion is. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we have earthquakes, just to demonstrate that this is something that's going to keep happening, okay? So here's where we live. If I can find my pointer. There we go. Here's Utah right here. And you can see this dark black line. That's the Wasatch Fault. It goes all the way from south of St. George, right through the middle of Utah, and up. It's buried by the volcanism from the Snake River Plain, and then it pops out on the other side, north of the Snake River Plain. And this area in brown we call the Rocky Mountain Seismic Belt. You can see there's been some earthquakes. I don't know if you can see, but this one right here is a 7.5. This one right here is a 7.3. There's been several in the Great Basin. The only one we've had close to us was the 1934 one, which President Hinckley told me about. He said he thought the world was coming to an end. There were huge plate glass windows in Salt Lake City that were falling down. It was a magnitude 6.8, but it was quite a ways away from Salt Lake, fortunately. But if you look at this, you can see that since we've had seismometers monitoring, which is essentially at the beginning of the 20th century, there's been an earthquake in the Great Basin about every 15 to 20 years. The last, I'm talking about major earthquakes, not like the little 5.7 we had in 2020. And there hasn't been one since 1983. So we don't have a huge amount of events to base our decision on, but enough strain energy has accumulated in the Great Basin to create a magnitude 7. 3 of them, right on the Wasatch Fault. And notice that Utah is the least impacted by earthquakes from our record, which means that earthquakes have a cycle. They happen, and then they accumulate energy, just like snapping your fingers. accumulate energy, accumulate energy, accumulate energy until the pressure overcomes the friction, and then it breaks, and then the cycle starts again. Well, the earthquake cycles for the Wasatch Fault are all in a mature or late stage. It's like there's a fuse to a time bomb. And the fuse is like the small earthquakes that are going on that we can measure, but you don't feel, the magnitude 1s and 2s and 3s, right? We get 40 of those a month, saying that, there's this fuse burning. Now it's burned all the way in. You can't really see whether, it's like holding that firecracker in your hand, and all of a sudden it burns all the way in and it blows up in your hand. You guys probably haven't had that experience, but I have. So why do we have these? Well, that's because of the San Andreas Fault. So you can see the San Andreas Fault right here is a plate boundary between the North American plate, which is this, and the Pacific plate, which is this. The Pacific plate is moving to the northwest. So it's kind of sideswiping the edge of North America. And in the process, it's pulling the western edge of North America apart like this, which is what's caused the Great Basin. It's called the Basin and Range province because you used to have just a big mountain range, and then because of this sideswipe, it's now a lot of the mountains have been turned into valleys. Like Salt Lake Valley. Salt Lake Valley was not made by a river. It was made by stretching of the Earth's crust, one earthquake at a time. It's an earthquake valley. We call it a rift valley, the Great Salt Lake Rift Valley, and it extends here to Utah Valley. If I show you the cross-section, if you can think of the building of the Rocky Mountains like building an arch like this, then those forces that built them changed so that we have now this sideswipe going on. And it's like one person pushing at the base of the arch and the keystone of the arch sinking one earthquake at a time like this. And that's what's created the Great Salt Lake Rift Valley. This is a more geologically accurate diagram where you can see there's this huge fault that goes right underneath the whole Great Basin, and each one of these blocks is one of the ranges. So this is the Wasatch Range right here. This is the Ochre Range right here. And we have this space in between that's filling up with sediment. The worst possible thing you can build a city on is unconsolidated sediment. But that's where it's flat, so that's what we've done, okay? Let me show you this map. It's a little bit technical, but you can see the outlines of the states here. These are all the earthquakes that we've recorded between 2003 and 2020. You can see the earthquake belt, the active Rocky Mountain seismic zone right up here, right? So it shows that this is just as active as places up here in Washington, Oregon, and here in California. And this map on the left shows the amount of energy that's building up. Okay? And you can see that where the San Andreas Fault is, because it's closer to the actual boundary, there's a lot more motion there. But the difference is this. California is prepared for an earthquake. They've been doing this for decades. And that's because they have more earthquakes than we do. They're reminded. I don't know if there are any less natural man in California than they are in Utah, but some of you might want to have an opinion of that. But they've definitely paid up front. They had an earthquake on Saturday in the 1930s, and many of the schools they had built collapsed. Fortunately, it was on a Saturday and nobody was in those schools. But they passed legislation that all the schools now had to be built to seismic code, and all the existing ones had to be retrofitted. It cost them a tremendous amount of money, but they did that. Since then, they've had 5 major earthquakes. Not one school has collapsed. And so there's 12, 15 million people that live on that red zone. The last 2 big earthquakes that they had, a total of 200 people died. And that's because of all of the work they've done up front. Unfortunately, Utah is not in that situation. There's a lot that needs to be done in your community and in other communities. This is one of my animations I made of how the Wasatch Range formed. You don't need to die to wait until you figure this out. A geologist can read the rocks. They can tell you what happened and give you an idea, right? Maybe Moses saw this when he had that grand vision from Heavenly Father. So these are the sedimentary rocks that were deposited. There was a big basin here a long time ago, and they filled up that gap. And these are the names of the rock types, not that you need to know those. But then what happened is that basin collided with essentially California and western Nevada. And what happened is these were all underwater, like a long ways underwater. They're full of marine fossils, right? And we know sea level doesn't change more than 200 meters at any time on the Earth. And so then what happened is this was scrunched. And these, what used to be seabeds, were lifted up out of the water to form the Rocky Mountain Range. You can see folds like this up most of the canyons if you go there, especially Provo Canyon. I almost wreck every time I go by it because I can't take my eyes off of it. But then what happened is you got sideswiped by California, by the Pacific Plate, and you can see that this mountain range started to collapse along what's called the Wasatch Fault right here. We've sped up time here. This is a 20 million year, it took 20 million years to do just this. You can see that the space that's being created here is being filled by erosion from the mountains with sand and mud. A little bit of gravel over here closer to the range. You can see there's a blue flash that comes and goes. That's Lake Bonneville, depending on the climate. When the climate's wet, it'll accumulate faster than it can evaporate. And when the climate's dry, it shrinks like our Great Salt Lake is doing now. And the Wasatch Fault even cuts through those terraces. So I don't know if you can see this, but the lake terraces that essentially go all the way around the basin, where the fault breaks them, it offsets them. So we know the age of the lake terrace, and so we also know the displacement by the fault, and we can determine what the slip rate is, how many earthquakes it took to do that. Okay, so here's a three-dimensional diagram of what I just showed you. Here's the range, here's the Wasatch Fault like this. It kind of curves down. This is where it's stuck, where it has the most pressure on it. If you go much deeper than that, it's too warm to break a rock. And so we call this the deepest part of the brittle zone. And so it's about 15 kilometers, about 10 miles down, is where it's stuck like this. And so that means that the epicenter, which is the part above where it's going to break, is going to be right in the middle of the valley. Here's what we call the hypocenter, where it's going to snap, and this is the epicenter directly above that. For example, the 2020 event happened in the middle of the valley. It's the first earthquake we've been able to document that's happened on this fault since all the saints have moved here. You can also see that this yellow stuff is called Sandy. We have a city called Sandy. Why? Because it's built on sand. I think the Savior said something about that. Right? The foolish natural man? Yeah. And great shall be the fall thereof. Unfortunately, we have some work to do. You can build, just like that house I showed you at the first slide, you can build to withstand the ground shaking that our buildings will actually experience. But you have to do it up front, and you have to go back and either tear down or retrofit other buildings that were built before there were seismic codes, which is anything before 1980. How many of you guys live in a house built before 1980? Wow, you guys are really lucky. This must be a really new part of Utah Valley development, because most of the places, almost everybody holds up their hands. And that's the sad news. There's over 100,000 unreinforced masonry buildings in Utah Valley. There's almost 200,000 of them in the Salt Lake Valley. The earthquakes that were in California that I told you about, almost all of the damage and almost all of the deaths happened in those unreinforced masonry buildings. The ones that didn't collapse had to be completely demolished. I've met many people who moved here after the earthquake, the Northridge earthquake in LA, 1983, I think, because they lost their home. The insurance companies didn't have enough money to pay out because of all the damage, but still only 100 people died. Okay, so this is how earthquakes work. This brick, essentially right here, represents Utah Valley, which you can see that fault zone separates it from the Wasatch Range. Okay, and so between earthquakes, it's like a spring being pulled. What earthquakes? And then it goes. This is, so if there's a little army guy on top of that brick, and great shall be the fall of that army guy. So now what I want you to do is I want you to raise your hand at the exact moment that the brick's going to slide. You've seen it already, and this is a very simple system. Just a brick on a cutting board, right? So let's see how good you guys can do. You're crying wolf! Now you know why it's impossible. The natural system is so much more complex than this. Every time there's an earthquake, the fault zone changes. We can't rely on just what happened last time. So there's a big buffer of time window when the earthquake's going to actually happen. We can't predict it within 50 to 100 years, if that. It's not the kind of thing that you're going to get a warning that a hurricane's coming. You can see it on the TV. Might hit us, might not. You have time to evacuate. It's nothing like that. You're sitting there fat and happy, natural man, watching a football game on TV, and all of a sudden, your house collapses on you. It's a completely different thing, and it's not just one or two homes. It's the entire region that's affected. Communication lines, the plumbing, especially since the valley, when it drops like this, so that's east, right? So the eastern part drops down more than the western part. And so the sewage lines start running backwards. And you get these like geysers coming out of your toilet, right? Of sewage stuff, depending on where you live. The airport is not far from the Great Salt Lake. You drop the eastern part of the valley, and the lake floods the airport. I mean, it's the kind of event that everybody remembers. Everything else that happens to them relative to when the earthquake occurred. Oh yeah, that was before the Great Salt Lake earthquake. Or that was after the Great Salt Lake earthquake. Okay, so the way that earthquakes work is you have the stick and then slip. And that's what the spring's supposed to represent. The plates are moving, but the rocks are a little bit elastic, so they will like stretch for a little while and then eventually they rebound. That's what creates the earthquake. So while the rocks are pressing against each other, they're stuck and then they slip, and all that pressure in that spring is recovered. And what it does is it makes some huge sound waves. That's what seismic waves are. They're huge, very low frequency sound waves. If you've ever been next to a car that has a woofer in it, your car starts to vibrate, right? Think of something that's 20 to 30 times lower wavelength than that. You can't actually hear an earthquake. An elephant can hear it because they have a big enough ear. Whales can hear them because they have a big enough ear. But unfortunately, we don't have any whales and elephants around here, right? And so we can't hear the seismic wave, but we can definitely feel what it does. Okay, so let's move on here. So when I first got here in 1998 to teach at BYU, most of my neighbors in Orem, where I lived, were of the opinion that because there's temples built all along the Wasatch Fault, that somehow that's going to keep it from actually moving. And I was just flabbergasted. They actually believed this. I was really impressed by their faith, but I was like, remember, the Lord is sending the earthquakes. Just like the Lord sent the waves and the wind for Jared and his people and tried to get them to prepare for it. So what we did is we did an experiment. We had these very high-resolution GPS receivers. Here's the receiver right here, 24 channels. And we have this really expensive and sophisticated antenna, which dampens all the other noise. We stick that antenna directly on top of a surveyed point. You can see that little dot in the middle of the triangle there. That's a millimeter in diameter. And so we have this telescope on the antenna, and we can put the crosshairs right on top of that dot. And then we come back a few years later and we remeasure the entire system. And the resolution of the GPS is so high we can measure millimeter differences in length over thousands of kilometers. And what we found is this. We found that the valley, all of those arrows are showing stretching. The valley is being stretched, just like that spring. Okay, and these are the lengths, so it's being stretched about 2 to 3 millimeters a year. Now that's just like, you can hardly see 2 to 3 millimeters a year. But the last time we had an earthquake in the Salt Lake Valley was 1,350 years ago. So that 2 to 3 millimeters turns into 2 to 3 meters since then. So when it actually ruptures, which could be during this talk, as far as I'm concerned, right? And fortunately, this building was built to seismic code. I will not give a talk in a building that's not built to seismic code, right? And what would happen is the valley would drop faster than the speed of sound, 3 meters, 2 to 3 meters. It would recover all of that. So that is actually more than 1G. I don't know if you've been on roller coasters, but when your butt comes off the seat and you're floating in the air, that's accelerations of higher than 1G. That's what we would experience here. Accelerations, that things, we would be suspended in the air and come down. Buildings would go up and come down. And then you get the sideward movement. And so this is evidence that the temples haven't stopped the movement, right? The temples are to help us make covenants to be prepared, right? To do all we can. We can't just say the temple's going to save us. I mean, in a spiritual sense, it definitely is, but the more we build, the more strain is accumulating along the fault. Okay, so here's the Wasatch Fault right here. Wow, you can't really see that very well, but all these little lines along the Wasatch Fault there are trenches that we've dug, like this one. So this is a Bonneville terrace right here, and this is that same terrace that has shifted down about 30 meters. One earthquake at a time, 2 to 3 meters, 2 to 3 meters, so that's about 10 earthquakes since that Bonneville terrace actually formed. So we dug right into the guts of it, and we can see the fault zone and what it's offset. And these are we've done this all along the range, and this is what we found right here. You can see that the fault zone is broken up into segments, like the Brigham City segment, the Weber segment, the Salt Lake City segment, the Provo segment, the Nephi segment, and so on. And these are the earthquakes that we've been able to find in the past. Like the Brigham City segment, look at this. There's a gap right here. It's been firing away about every 900 to 1,000 years. It has an earthquake, and then it's been over 1,000, it's been over 2,000 years. Nothing's happened here. This had 2 of them. We think that this one might have taken some of the strain of that one. But this is the most dangerous part of this graph. Where most of the people live in Utah is right here in this big seismic gap. 1,370 years ago was the last major event. And again, I say it's plus or minus 200 years. I mean, that's as good as we can do. We use very blunt tools to try to figure out when the last earthquakes were. But we know the rate in which the strain is accumulating because of our GPS measurements. So we can calculate or how large an earthquake would be if it happens right now. So what is the earthquake risk? Well, here's the Provo segment of the Wasatch Fault right here, which is 70 kilometers long. The longer the segment that breaks, the larger the earthquake. Okay? Well, the last earthquake we had on the Provo segment, the big one, was 500 years ago. It created Provo Bay, which is that little offshoot of Utah Lake. But so it hasn't had a lot of time to build up a strain. So it's only built up 1.3 meters of strain. But even releasing that over a huge fault zone like this is going to create a magnitude 7 earthquake. And the epicenter is going to be right here somewhere in the valley. Okay, what about the Salt Lake City segment? Well, it's much smaller, fortunately. It's only 43 kilometers long, but it's also got 3.2 meters of strain accumulated along it, 10 feet. And so a 7.1, if we're lucky. The Weber segment, again, it's gone more recently. It could produce a 6.9. What I'm worried about is what's happened in many other earthquakes I've been associated with, especially in Asia, where one large one, like the Salt Lake City segment, goes, and then you have what we call stress contagion, which means that you load the other segments. So they're going along their normal cycle. It's only been 500 years since they had their last earthquake, and all of a sudden all this stress comes from the neighbor, and it causes it to go full cycle before it should have. And so if all three of those rupture within minutes or hours or days, that's the worst case scenario. If they all rupture at the same time, which it doesn't look like they usually do. If you look at this one, you can see that there's offsets between these. Maybe this was a double rupture right here. Maybe this ruptured all the way through. So that's the worst case scenario, having a 7.3. It's going to be, if it happens within the next 10 to 20 years before we can get ready for it, it's going to be thousands and thousands of deaths. And the whole Wasatch Front is going to be a different place. It's going to take decades to recover from. And this is where we are, right here, right? Well, we're a long ways away from the fault zone. Unfortunately, the epicenter is going to be right there, right? Because the epicenter, the fault is inclined underneath the valley, and the epicenter is at about 15 kilometers depth. The fault dips at about 40 degrees, so you can just do the math, and you can see where the hypocenter is going to be. The epicenter is going to be right in that part of the valley. It might not be right where this is, but it'll be some part of that valley there. Maybe in the lake or some other place. What you do have to worry about in Lehi is this. This is a liquefaction map. Liquefaction is what happens when you have loose sand and gravel. You can see here that this is above the water table, or it would all be saturated. You can see that there's actually friction between the sand grains, okay? But when you start to shake it like this, that friction or that strength goes away because it gets replaced with fluid. So heavy things sink and light things rise. Liquefaction creates most of the damage from earthquakes. You can see that this is where we're in a high liquefaction zone right here due to the fact that we're built in this close to the Jordan River Valley. All right, so what's the earthquake forecast? Exactly when earthquakes happen is unpredictable, unknowable. Enough pressure has already accumulated to cause a strong magnitude 7 or 7.2 along several segments of the Wasatch Fault. And unstable slopes are a major landslide risk because of how steep the Wasatch Front is. Okay, so the last thing I want to focus on is how we reduce the risk. So this is the first way. You have to either eliminate or retrofit buildings that are not built to seismic code, which is a huge amount of buildings. But just worry about the ones in Lehi first, okay? So you can see that since I got at BYU, BYU's been starting to tear down buildings. It was a hard, really hard sell that took President Hinckley calling the risk management department at BYU and asking them to please tear down Deseret Towers. Because DT didn't really stand for Deseret Towers, it standed for Death Trap. Many of you probably lived in those, right? And these are the new dorms. It's a win-win situation. The students are so much happier, right? And they're safe. President Hinckley said, we cannot allow for our students to be squished by an earthquake. It's just not going to happen. We've got to do something. And just more recently, the Harris Fine Arts Center, I was always embarrassed it was called the Harris Fine Arts Center. No support. Those walls are just brick. No shear walls at all. Watch what happens. This is what would happen during an earthquake right here. Watch this. How does that, yeah. I would never go to any performances there. I would never walk through that building, even though it was called the Harris Fine Arts Center. It didn't matter to me, right? Okay, so we've gone around the valley trying to get schools up to seismic code, which means the schools that were built in 1965 that my grandson was going to was one of my focuses. And I went there to the PTA meeting, and we're standing in this gym, and I said, do you guys realize that the roof of this school is not even attached to the walls? And the walls of the school are not even attached to the foundation? And your kids are in here almost every day, eating lunch and playing and stuff? And so my companion there, who's the PTA president, went on a rampage and finally got the school district to do something, right? And they tore down the school. And when the bulldozer hit the first wall, the school just went doo, 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 like that. What about Lehi High School? When was that built?
They just rebuilt it.
They renovated.
They renovated, okay. You need to find out what they did if you're going to send your kids there. When I came here, I moved to Timpanogos High School because I knew it was built to seismic code. I go, I don't care how good they are at sports. We're going to live here. You guys are going to be, because the other options were Provo High and Orem High, which were horrible. Orem High now has been rebuilt, and BYU purchased Provo High. I'm like, no, that's the wrong thing to do. But there's high schools, American Fork High School, right? Pleasant Grove High School. There's many buildings that need to be torn down. The other thing is something that you can do right now is you can fix non-structural hazards. This is to prevent this from happening in your home, especially if one of your kids is underneath those and gets squished, right? And so non-structural hazards are any kind of falling objects that can do damage within your home because they're not secure. And again, I want to emphasize, it's not the earthquakes that kill people. It's the falling objects that earthquakes loosen that kill people. We can do something about those. We can't do something about a landslide except for move away. But for the rest of the stuff, we can do something about that. Okay, I have got to finish, but there's a YouTube site called Quake Busters Team, which we set up with my students and I. This tells you how to secure small things. This tells you how to secure bookcases and so on, how to do evaluation of your home. But the most important part of this are the earthquake alarms. This is my study. This is what I've done to my bookshelves. Those are into studs in the wall. Okay, my mother-in-law's clock, other stuff. This is the most important thing right here. When we have an earthquake, there are different types of seismic waves. The first one is what we call the primary wave, which is the fastest, and it ripples through the ground like that. And then the destructive waves, the S waves and L waves come, which have a lot higher amplitude and a lot longer wavelength. There's a time delay between when that first P wave comes, which nobody feels, but a seismometer does, and when the damaging waves come behind it. It's like lightning and thunder. You can tell how far away the lightning struck just by counting before the sound wave gets to you, right? Sound wave is like the destructive wave of an earthquake. The light is like the P wave. And these detectors, like this, these quake alarms, will sense the P wave and cause an alarm. There's a little pendulum that hangs between two sensors. The P wave will cause it to touch and go off. And you can have seconds, like precious seconds, to know an earthquake is coming, to duck, cover, and hold on. Don't go to a door jam, right? Don't try to find triangle of life. Just do what this says, duck, cover, and hopefully go under something that things aren't going to fall on. Most of the homes in Salt Lake and Utah Valley are not going to collapse. And so you don't have to worry as much about getting out. If you live in a really badly constructed home, you use the alarm to get out of the building as fast as you can, okay? We should have these in every classroom of every school. They cost $30. Each child could bring $1 to class, you'd have an earthquake alarm. The teacher could go up there and flick it like this every now and then. They would get used to the sound of it, and they could have an earthquake drill. How much time is wasted on fire drills? How many schools have burnt down? None, right? Earthquakes are going to be much more of a hazard than these. This is something you can do. You can do in your home as well. So to close, this is your to-do list. Secure and eliminate structural hazards, buildings that are not built to seismic code. 2, secure the non-structural hazards in your home. You can go to our Quake Busters team YouTube channel and it'll tell you how to do that. It costs like $50 to do that. Plus the earthquake alarm for $30. Install earthquakes alarm. Use a regular earthquake drill. I don't even know if there's schools around here do them, because my kids went through the school system and never had one. And then if you live next to an unstable slope, monitor it. I testify to you that preparedness pays off. Even if you don't get to see the benefits during your lifetime, down the road somewhere, you're going to save somebody's life. That's what the gospel is all about. That's what the atonement is all about, is paying the price up front for the future generations. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Hey, Bree, what you doing?
I'm protecting my dolls from the earthquake. I don't want them to get squished.
Bree, get under the table.
Grandma, are you okay? Honey, I'm okay. I'm okay. Don't worry. I'm okay.